So imagine this for a second. You're a budding producer who's just completed their 5th beat. It's pretty decent, definitively better than any of the other 4 beats you've made, but you're still not satisfied. No, what you want to produce is a song. You don't want to stick to simply being another dime a dozen beat maker, but alas, you've come upon a problem. Where do I go from here? Then you come upon a mystical new concept called form. You can take your beat you just made, add another beat marginally similar to the first, and then repeat your first beat to create your first cohesive song with a distinct structure. You learn about verse-chorus form and how to write a bridge. Now you're getting somewhere. However, you soon meet a new wall that you think never existed. Where do I go from here? That is the question I want to answer today. I feel like so many people are concerned with what form should I use for my song, that many of us young musicians have forgotten the more important question. Why should I use this form for my song? Truth be told, I'm no beatmaker, and I never have been. I started with music notation and imitating conventions in the band music I heard, so the concept of stringing ideas together came quite natural to me as I developed and continued to develop my skills as a composer. However, after using verse, chorus, and binary form about a trillion times, I started to wonder if there's any way forward. Sure, there's other types of form out there more in line with classical convention. The Rondo, Sonata, theme and variations. Sure, you could consider them more complex, but that wasn't really the issue here. No, the issue is how can I use this form in a way that doesn't seem so arbitrary? Last year, I had the pleasure of attending the Riverside Jazz Festival with my school band at the time. I met and talked to John DeVersa, the leader of his own progressive jazz group and the genius behind tunes like Cheeks and Your Mother. This one's called Your Mother. I asked him about how he came up with this form, and he told me it had much to do with the emotions you want to convey in your piece. Even in something as simple as a blues, you can hear the introduction of ideas, the development of those ideas, then something new to turn us around before finally returning to the first idea. He gave me the task of writing a blues a day. I was dedicated to this until about 5 days later when I joined a pit orchestra for the school's musical production. Nice going. But what I learned from that was everything has form, from the shortest melodic ideas to the entirety of a multi-movement piece. It was my first introduction to the idea of form as something other than an assignment for my music technology class, but it wasn't until some words of wisdom from a different composer that really made me rethink form as a concept. This is Eric Whitaker. If you're in choir, you've probably sang his music. If you're in a wind band, you've probably played his band arrangements of his choir music. And if you're in a marching band, you've probably played his marching arrangements of his band arrangements of his choir music. He's an incredibly acclaimed choir and band composer who has a very distinct style. I was lucky enough to be taken through an online course of his through my band director and music theory instructor during high school. Now, if you're inclined to check out his full course, then I'll leave a link down below if you're interested in rethinking your entire creative process. But I especially found his notes on musical form interesting, especially because it started with the phrase, "a snake wearing pants." Now you're probably going to tell me that snakes don't wear pants, and that's where you're right, but also where you're wrong. In the mind of a child, perhaps a snake could wear pants. After all, a young child has probably never seen a snake, so who's to stop him from drawing a snake wearing pants? This admittedly nonsensical situation is a reflection on how children learn about the world around them. With so little prior knowledge, children rely on their creativity and imagination to make sense of the world. This is why in a test of creative potential done by NASA, 98% of 4 to 5-year-old children were deemed creative geniuses. This number diminished rapidly with age until adulthood, where only 2% of adults retain this creative genius status. Am I saying that you need to be a child to be creative? Well, admittedly that statement is not entirely wrong, but perhaps we can learn a little bit about the creative process from the drawings of children. This is my sketchbook. I'm not really a good visual artist, but regardless, this is where Whitaker, and now me as well, start. Most of my drawings seem arbitrary and a bit random, but the point of this sketching pad is to create abstract ideas and sceneries that I can turn into music. Some of it's drawing, some of it's direct notes. Because of my love for writing, much of it tends to be words too. Most of the time, the very last thing I add to this sketching pad is this horn-looking thing. This is my form. It's the culmination of the story that I want to tell, a story that starts with these sketches, and there's the answer to my question. Musicians use form to tell a story. It could be a serious story or something more lighthearted. It could be something super easy to understand or ideas that are more abstract, but music at its heart exists to tell stories that convey some sort of emotion. From that point onward, I always tried to consider what type of form would best complement the story I'm trying to tell. To give an example of what I mean by all of that, I'm going to go over my creative process in writing Autumn's Passacaglia, a piece for orchestra. The idea behind this particular piece was that of a boy traveling to a dream world and coming face to face with the deepest parts of his mind. Passacaglia comes from the idea of repetition in that traditional form, as if the boy is experiencing these dreams over and over again, with each level of the spiral growing more and more strange. As such, I decided to use strophic form in order to convey this idea of a repeating spiral. The 16-bar melody across the entire 8 minutes of the piece never changes. All the development and variety is done by the non-melody instruments. That way, I could have my cake and eat it too. Even with the seemingly limited choice of form, I was able to have this giant arch of an overall structure that built to a massive climax and then immediately died down back to the quiet of the start. This climax in particular is important in that it's the only deviation from the melody in the entire piece. This was another thing I could trace back to my sketches. One of the big themes I wanted to cover in this piece was this idea of epiphany, which I achieved through resolving this ridiculously dissonant cluster chord to this ridiculously consonant power chord. To dial in the effect of the climax even further, the melody was stripped down to a single note, a high C held by the upper strings and woodwinds. While I wouldn't exactly call it its own unique part in the form, it's an important deviation from the standard section that served to make the peak of my piece hit that much harder. So there's my form, right? Well, sure, but there's more to form than just the big picture. Smaller sections, especially melodies, function in much of the same way as the song itself. The melody begins by introducing these 4 phrases, related to each other by a similar rhythmic idea of busy in the beginning, long note at the end. We can call this A. The next section of the melody, a 4-bar idea, breaks that rhythmic consistency by including these 2 16th notes towards the end of the phrase, increasing the activity alongside the parallel chordals, which then bring an entirely new flavor to the table. We can call this B. Then the A section returns. These 2 rhythms are called back to and the chords return. However, the chords are slightly different, and so are the order of the ideas in the melody. This section is different. It's a more developed version of the previous A section. That all sounds complicated, but this form within a form is incredibly common. And if you produce any sort of music before, you've probably done this very thing without realizing it. A much more obvious example would be in Percy Grainger's Lincolnshire Posy. Every movement is in strophic form, yet in the very first movement, we can hear a very distinct melodic form of A-A-B-A, a common form in European folk music. Now, not everyone is out there to write pieces for orchestras, but form is everywhere and it's universal. Listening and understanding as to why musicians use the form that they do, I'd say is just as important as understanding chords, melodies, instruments, what have you. After all, it's all in service of telling the story that you want your audience to hear. Music's really only a collection of pleasant noises unless it means something. And I think that the key to unlocking that meaning starts with a sketchbook and a drawing of a snake wearing pants.